Are you aware that plans are underway to give every human on the planet a universal digital identity?
They have plans to mark every human being on the planet.
That's the ultimate goal.
Yes.
That every human will have his or her unique identity.
Yes.
And everything that you need in life, every document, access to buildings, government services, transactions,
yes,
will be done with that global identity number. What they don't know, as Doc said, is how they're going to do it.
Right.
How's this thing going to look at the end? What do you know about it, Edward?
Well, from my research today into this topic, Rick, there are a few characteristics about this universal digital identity. Rick, to us, this term is new, but to the heads of banks, Standard Chartered, UBS, banks
HSBC,
HSBC, this term isn't foreign. It's something actually of a very interesting project. I actually, before we left on the final day, was able to run into a president, a senior official at UBS, and I asked him about the universal digital identity. It actually coincided with a lot of the information I read today, is that this is the project for the next 20 years.
You spoke just briefly with the president of UBS, Bank of Switzerland, and you asked him about the digital identity system. Was he surprised that you asked him that question?
Actually, I think he was actually very entertained that brought up the question. He sounded like no one had actually inquired about this subject, yet it was something he was very passionate about.
Right.
It's something he told me they weren't ready, his bank at least, ready to deploy this yet, but he said, you will start to see this in 5 to 10 years, and it's something we are investing a lot of time and resource into producing.
We will start to see it, Doc, in 5 to 10 years.
And what I found fascinating about his conversation is that this was the first time anyone had asked him about it. Edward was the first one to bring up that question to him about universal digital identity. So it kind of caught him off guard a little bit, right?
Oh, it's absolutely true. And you know, what we can find right now online about this, Rick, there is actually a UN initiative called ID2020. Now, this initiative is funded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation and has gotten some money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among other globalist organizations. But, Rick, this organization specifically is targeting the 1.1 billion, quote, poverty-stricken refugees to get them put into biometric databases. Now, why this is tied in with
When you say refugees, you mean there's 1.1 billion refugees floating around the world?
They classify anyone living under the poverty line and anyone who's transient, such as a refugee or someone who's fled a war zone, as in that 1.1 billion.
Okay. All right, but they're not all war refugees.
They're not all war refugees.
Okay. So, but they're basically going after people in extreme poverty.
Right.
They're going to be the first targeted to get a universal digital identity. And the justification for it is they will finally have access to banking.
Yes, they're seeing it as a human right. This is almost akin to water and food and air itself.
Who are you? This is a question that often comes up in our daily lives. Whether we're boarding a plane, checking our bank balance, or paying a utility bill, we regularly have to prove we are who we say we are. However, more than 1 billion people across the globe cannot prove who they are with any certainty. Many of those have never had a form of verifiable ID to begin with, and more than 15 million were victims of identity theft last year alone. With this in mind, we have developed a unique digital identity prototype to modernise identity management for organisations and individuals. Leveraging the power of blockchain and biometrics, the system makes establishing, tracking, and managing digital identities more efficient, user-friendly, secure, and less open to fraud. Let's follow Joseph as he establishes and builds his identity. At an enrolment station, his biometrics are securely captured through his fingerprints, voice, face, or an iris scan. Then several steps are taken to create a unique identifier using multiple security protocols. This identifier is then recorded on the blockchain, which acts as an index with links to all applicable data. This makes it easy to locate, access, and share information without Joseph's personal data being stored on the blockchain. Using an application on his phone, Joseph creates a personal profile that's multi-factored and authentication secured. The app allows Joseph to generate his own set of public and private keys which he can use to sign the data he sends to others. That way third parties can be absolutely certain the information is his. Joseph shares the public key using a QR code. When he scans this QR code at the enrolment station, an official attestation is added to his profile and signed by a private key. This is the beginning of Yosef's living identity, an identity that he will build with each stamp he collects from his university, his employer, or from government and non-government agencies. The major benefit of this identity system is that Yosef is always in control of his own personal data. He determines which information is shared, who sees it, and for how long. Instead of multiple paper documents, he can use a single, easy-to-manage app. The system makes life easier for organisations too. It's interoperable with other databases, so existing identity data stays put. Efficiency for background checks is greatly improved, as an organisation can choose to trust existing attestations instead of repeating the process. For additional security, there's also the option of checking data at source if the user grants permission. The system is also flexible. While this prototype has been created for a mobile device, the technology can work with or without connected devices. This prototype is the basis for our work with ID2020, a public-private partnership committed to providing a digital identity to the 1.2 billion individuals living without a way to prove their existence. We believe it's the first step towards a digital identity that makes answering the question, "Who are you?" as simple as saying, "I am."
You spoke with Mr. Akshay Sharma.
Yes, that's correct.
He's a principal analyst of NextCurve. What did he tell you?
All right, Mr. Sharma, actually, because of his 20-year experience in the telecom industry, he actually knew about the universal digital identity. When I told him he'd heard about this and we weren't allowed into the session at Davos, he's like, "Oh, I know quite a bit about this. I would be up to speak to you in an interview format about this." So
very friendly, very open with us.
Good.
So the first clip you're going to hear, Rick, is he gives us a background of his knowledge about the development of the universal digital identity.
All right, let's watch this one.
Akshay, we had a discussion prior to this about the universal digital identity. This is something I heard quite a bit about at Davos, the World Economic Forum this past year. Can you explain a little bit, some background about this?
Well, as you know, we all have identities. We have a name, we have perhaps a social security number, a phone number, IP type, fully qualified domain names, email addresses, and things like that. And what we're trying to do with this UDI concept is use biometrics and have a universal way of identifying ourselves based on biometrics.
And this is all digital, right? This isn't like a physical piece of paper or a driver's license or a passport, right?
Exactly, and hopefully it's not a stamp on our forehead either. So hopefully it's something that is unique to every individual, like your DNA or like other attributes that we have.
Have they explored using stamps as a possible use of identifying, or?
Well, not a stamp on our forehead, but there are ways to identify us. So we have unique, like our thumb fingerprints and things like that. So our iris, what's in our eyeballs and our corneas and all that. So we're going to see more and more of these type of biometrics being exposed over time.
Is there a connection between the UN's ID 2020 and the blockchain?
Yes, at Davos, they made that connection and said that part of the reason for a UDI is it's a necessary component for the ID 2020, because the only way for, let's say, a war refugee leaving his country to be identified in his host nation is by his iris and by his fingerprint, which are unique.
What are we going to see in this next video clip about ID 2020?
So he actually expands further on what he knows about this. He actually spent the good part of the cell phone revolution as the chief director of research at Gartner, which is a major billion-dollar telecom company. He actually discusses, Rick, what is involved with the ID 2020 program, how it's going to be implemented, and for example, the sensors in smart cities that are going to be able to capture the data.
Okay, let's watch it.
Now, at Davos, we learned about ID 2020, which is an initiative by the UN to put in 1.1 billion refugees into a biometric database. Now, you mentioned biometrics. How are the biometrics potentially going to be gathered and put together? Is it through devices? Is it through the IoT networks? Is it through user submission? How is this going to be put together?
Well, ideally this should be done through whatever hospital or whatever, place of birth where a child comes. and we can identify them so that they get some sort of benefit. We can also do better tracking of people for, let's say, census type reporting, and we're going to see more and more of these as people move. You know, the conflicts arise all over the world, and people do move from one location to another. And, you know, providing better holistic service to people, I think, can be a beneficial outcome. But you mentioned sensors. I mean, it'll be all of the above. There will be, you know, biometric sensors. There will be other ways to identify people at hospitals and whatnot.
Amazing.
Yes.
You know what it sounds like, Doc?
Yep, we're moving into that time where every single living human being will be able to be monitored and tracked, no matter where they are.
By a global brain.
Yes.
Yes.
So you got to put it all together. You got blockchain. It's not just that you've got separate technologies. It's when they all come together and they're interconnected, a fusion of these technologies. And then someday, one entity, one being, one creature has access to all this information, all this power.
Yes.
And now has in his hands the ability to number and track and monitor every human on the planet, and literally to shut down their lives.
Yes. And we've went on further conversation with Mr. Sharma there, where we talked further about, you know, that tracking software and that tracking hardware that may exist. So here's that clip as well.
We'll watch one more. Here we go.
You mentioned, you know, jokingly, but partially there are people who have looked at potentially this identification being something that's implanted, whether it be through the biohacking revolution or something that's offered as a healthcare thing. Do you know much about this field?
Yeah, I know. I've seen cases like in Mexico City where to be an employee at some very critical agencies, you had to have an implant inside, like an RFID tagged implant. That's a little invasive, I would think. I think there's ways around that. You don't need to have that type of device. I know they're also talking about, you know, doing it for animals like dogs, and, you know, hopefully it doesn't hurt them. But, you know, there's a value there because dogs do get lost. But for people, I think, you know, we do have enough biometric identifiers.
2030 is a major date for the globalists.
Right.
They are planning to bring into reality much of their agenda by the year 2030. The banker said to you, the UBS president, that 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to start seeing it. Well, 10 years from now would be the late 2020s.
And that date actually came up when I was looking into ID 2020 specifically. Rick, that is their goal marker for when they want that 1.1 billion person count to be biometrically implanted into a universal digital identity. They are seeing this as their goal marker.
2030?
2030.
Now, the other thing that we heard at Mobile World last year was, you know, the plan to give every human being a smartphone, that they would have access to a smartphone and global Wi-Fi.
Right.
They're going to saturate the planet with Wi-Fi through low orbiting satellites, that every square inch of the planet would be connected to the global brain. So they mentioned the date 2025. And that date was touted as the digital divide, meaning that by 2025, all of the developing nations will have caught up technologically with the developed nations.
Suddenly it's going to be level for everybody?
Yes.
Is that the thought?
Everybody would at least have a cell phone and internet connectivity. So this is the major foundation that they have to put in before they can go to the universal digital identity system.
Right.
Well, see, that part is it's key to this, Rick, because actually there's a company called GEM based out of California. They're actually a machine learning company that's working specifically with the development of universal digital identification tools. Now, Rick, the CEO of this company, Micah Wickenspecht, he actually said this in the white paper I was reading earlier. People have to stop thinking about blockchain as fintech. It's not fintech. It's about how do we build a global computer? And if you have that, how then do we log into the global computer? Now, Rick, why this is important? You mentioned smartphones, right? There's a goal to get everyone with a smartphone. This smartphone, Rick, one, you use your thumb every time you use this. And secondly, the camera has a direct sight to your eyes. when we're talking about the biometrics which are involved with a universal digital identification, Rick, they're talking about the fingerprints, the iris scans, and other core components of your face. With this plan that the GSMA has announced at the Mobile World Congress, they will be able to do this on a global scale.
Well, he just said something that just stunned me.
What's that, Rick?
But every time we're using our phone, we're using our thumb and our eyes.
That's true.
The button becomes the thumb scanner. The camera is the eye scanner. And this will be taking place ubiquitously. Nobody will even know. They'll even be aware you're being scanned, your thumb and your eyes being scanned every time you use the phone.
Multiple different companies that have smartphones, multiple different social media networks. Right now, I believe there are huge databases of our individual fingerprints, our individual eyes. The thing that they're going to accomplish by 2030 is the pairing, the bringing together of all this data where you do have one singular identity online and legally.
Yeah, you know, when I interact with my bank, I have one kind of identity. If I interact on social media, I have a different kind of identity right now. There's different information. With universal digital identity, it's bringing all those different identities of Doc Burkhart that exist out there as I interact with the larger network out there. It brings them all together under one umbrella.
And let's admit it, we're all overwhelmed with passwords.
Right.
I mean, if you're active online, you have so many passwords that what do we have now? We have password. We pay for companies.
Password banks, basically.
Password banks.
Right. So we don't have to remember our passwords.
That's right. So the next stage after that is just have one identity.
Right.
Why have a company that stores all of your passwords when you could just have you, not a password, but you stored on the blockchain?
Well, Rick, it's going to be a pitch to convenience. Because you mentioned the blockchain here. The blockchain itself, the one thing it provides for, let's say, Westerners is that you are guaranteed, it's authenticated, pre-authenticated data. The blockchain is very hard to delete, especially when it's shared across large swaths of a network. So you can be guaranteed that no one's going to be able to get into this thing. And secondly, no one's going to be able to take your identity. Because that's one of the arguments right now against biometrics, is that if someone were to hack, your profile, Rick, and they were able to get your fingerprint in your eye, you only have one. It's not like you can scrape off your fingerprint. If it's hacked, it's gone forever. But with the blockchain, the argument would be that this is an extra protection against a stealing of your identity.
Can you make an argument that this is a good thing?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, it's going to be more convenient, of course. Why have all these multiple identities? Have one. That's the convenient side. The other side is, too, the blockchain is supposed to be secure, unhackable. Any lock, though, in my opinion, can be picked, but that's how they're touting the blockchain. For the poor, it does give them access to services that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Another aspect to this, too, Rick, is that blockchain, though it does decentralize, to take away from the middlemen and decentralize industries, it will also empower certain individuals, certain companies to control swaths of information, swaths of services. We talk about voting, for example, here. If one company has developed the blockchain software and the systems for individuals to vote from their smartphone, for example, that company now has incredible power to potentially, if they were bad and they were evil, to change the vote, to manipulate.
Wait a minute, I thought the blockchain can't be altered.
There are different kinds of blockchains.
That's what we learned.
There's a public, transparent version, and then there are privatized blockchains. So what companies have figured out is they can create this internal blockchain where you have certain ways to edit it. And there are allowances to edit it. So someone who's at the top of this pyramid in the blockchain will be able to maybe change a piece of information, and he's granted access to do so. We look at what's happened with Aadhaar, the biometric database the Indian government put together, where virtually the entire population now has a 12-digit number assigned to their name and is moving toward the direction with a new pay app that you would need to have this identity, need to have your biometrics already put into this to even buy things in the marketplace.
Every Indian will have to be scanned. Their eyes and their fingers will have to be scanned. All right, now, I see a lot of cool, exciting things with blockchain, and I can get very excited about this. I love where this is going, but I also see the potential for some dark things.
Yes.
Okay, so let's take this newscast to another level right now about blockchain. What are some of the darker things that blockchain could be used to usher in?
A global biometric database of the entire population of the globe.
A global, unique identifying number?
Yes.
Where every human would be entered into the blockchain?
Yes.
And there is another aspect too, and Edward asked a great question in one of our sessions. In fact, he did that earlier this morning in one of our sessions, where he confronted, some of the people on the panel and said, "What would prevent any of your companies from issuing cryptocurrencies and blockchain credits toward maybe somebody operating, a sex trafficking operation out of Malaysia?"
Yes.
And what was their response?
They gave me a blank stare, like this wasn't a problem. This wasn't something that they were necessarily liable for, nor was it something they're looking to even address. Now, Rick, we know that right now, formerly it was called the Old Silk World. It's an online database in the dark web used for trafficking these other things. We know that people in that system were using Bitcoin and these other devices to sell and buy children.
The point that we're making is the human race is now actively, aggressively moving into this final stage of humanity.
Yes.
Where the beast system is rising. We're not trying to frighten you. We're trying to wake you up, get you engaged, get you aware of what's going on in the world around us, that these plans are actually underway. There are powerful, influential organizations and individuals and entities that are actively meeting and discussing blueprints, plans, timetables, deadlines to implement a worldwide digital identity system for 6 to 7 billion people on the planet. My friends, we're being told that we're going to see it coming into existence in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, hopefully it's not going to be a pluggable implant that's, impregnated into us, impregnated into us, impregnated into us.